Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Bookstore's virtual event series. I'm Stephanie Valdez, the store owner. I'm thrilled to welcome Tania James in conversation with Patrick Ryan, presented as part of the One Story Summer Conference. Now to some housekeeping. If you have any questions for tonight's guest, you can click on the Q&A button, which is at the bottom of your screen, to submit them. We'll be asking those at the end of the program. There's also a chat box through which I'll be posting a link to buy tonight's book if you haven't already. And now I'll introduce tonight's guests and we'll get started. Tania James is the author of the novels Loot, The Tusk That Did the Damage, and The Atlas of the Unknowns, and the short story collection Aerograms. Her fiction has appeared in Boston Review, Granta, Guernica, One Story, A Public Space, and the Kenyon Review. She lives in Washington, D.C. Patrick Ryan is the author of the novel Buckeye, forthcoming from Random House in 2024. He is the author of the acclaimed short story collection, The Dream Life of Astronauts, as well as the novel and stories Send Me, and 3 novels for young adults. His work has been included in the Best American Short Stories, Tin House, Crazy Horse, Tale of Two Cities, and elsewhere. The former associate editor of Granta, he is editor-in-chief of both One Story and One Teen Story. And now I'll turn things over to Patrick and Tania.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Community Bookstore. We're super happy to be back with you all and doing this again. And we couldn't do it if you weren't facilitating us. And I want to say thanks to everybody who's tuning in, especially to the students who we have at the One Story Summer Writers Conference, which is the event that has spearheaded this whole thing coming about. And I'm really happy that tonight I get to talk with Tania James. Tania and I, as I was just reminding her, we were crossing literary memory paths. We first crossed paths when I worked at Granta. You had just published Atlas of the Unknowns, I believe, and you were writing short stories. And you sent us a story, or Nicole sent, your agent sent us a story, Lion and Panther
in London.
Lion and Panther in London. And that story that we published, that was included in your short story collection, Aerogram.
Yeah.
And Aerograms came out in 2012, right?
Yes.
I think. So just a little side note, the title story, where did you publish the title story from that collection? Tell us just a little bit about that.
I was going to lead with that. Yeah, the title story of that collection was my first published story, and I was lucky enough to have it published in One Story. And I still remember getting my little blue booklet in the mail and giving it to my parents, like, see, somebody actually believes in me. And my mom putting it on her little Bible, and it was just such a big deal. I don't think I realized what a big deal it was at the time, because I hadn't submitted it myself. It was Nicole, my agent, who had submitted. But yeah, I then became a subscriber, and then realized the incredible array of talent you all have gathered in this magazine. And I feel like One Story is hugely responsible for my part of my career, as a writer.
Thank you. I actually did. I asked because I thought it would be fun to highlight that. I didn't ask to give such a wonderful work for the magazine. Yeah, but it is, the first, like, my first publication was in a newspaper print, like printed on newspaper, so that now it's yellow and brittle, or brown and brittle. Little thing that came out of Toledo that had a circulation of 200. That was my first publication. But the reason I say that is because still, that was that first time that somebody said, yeah, you were good enough for us to put some ink on a page for people to read. And it makes a huge difference, right? It's just, you never forget that.
Yeah, I think there's always still slightly a feeling of like, maybe they got it wrong, maybe this is like a pity publication, right? But I still feel that way with every publication. But yeah, it's huge to just, especially early on, those little moments of permission that that you're so desperate for in the beginning and are very hard to come by. But yeah, that was
So
definitely.
interesting, and you call it permission, which is exactly what it feels like from that end. But on the other end, I especially know now from working at it, it's the honor. It's the pleasure. You know what I mean? Like to get a story and have an author say, I trust you. I mean, I get it. The author's going to say, yes, one story, I want to be one story, cool. But at the same time, the author's saying, yeah, I trust you. We're going to spend some time on this. I'm going to hopefully listen to what you have to say. You know, we'll collaborate for a bit, and then it's going to come out.
Yeah.
And it's it's an enormous, I don't know, it's just an enormous stepping stone that, and my first publication was not the first time I was edited, but I'll bet you that you were edited by Hannah.
I was edited. I still remember one of her notes because she was so fine about the editing, the line by line editing. And there was one word I thought I could get away with, and it was the word limb, Limn. And I think I'd read it in like 3 stories. I was like, light limbing something. And she was like, are you sure that's what you want to say here? And I was like, damn it, nothing, can't get, it's not that the word itself was wrong, but somehow she knew it wasn't the right word for that sentence in that story. And I just thought I could kind of slide that past. And she just, she's such a eagle-eyed kind of editor, but also, I mean, I had never been edited before in that way either. I mean, I'd been in an MFA program, so I knew what, being workshopped and people writing on your stories, but having one editor who is so experienced and who I admired as a writer as well, take that time it felt really like, it felt like what I had imagined being a writer would feel like,
Yes.
Real.
Yes, and then one can certainly go on to publish in other places and not have an experience like that. I mean, not have a bad experience, but not have that kind of editorial involvement. It's just a cherished, great thing. Hannah did wonders for me. You were, just to date us all, you were in 2007.
Yeah.
I was in 2005.
Oh.
And so I always tell Hannah we were like Muppet babies back then. With heads and editing and writing, and she did wonders for me. Okay, so I love Luke so much. I love the cover. I love bring it in focus. I love the title. I want to be able to talk about it a bit here without spoiling anything. I don't know if that's really possible. I know that you want to read from the ending, but I know that that's not like some big reveal spot necessarily. But so maybe we can talk about it without revealing too much, because it hasn't been out for very long and a lot of people will not have had a chance to read it. I know that we're about to hear from you. I will just say, for people tuning in who haven't had a chance to read Loot yet, it's a historical novel. It's set in begins rather in 1794 in Mysore, India. It covers about 50 years. It goes to France. It goes to England. I know that, Tania, you have described it as a heist novel, which I think is fantastic. I love that. It is also, I hope you would agree, a romance. It's got suspense. It's got a lot of horrific violence rendered beautifully and quickly and not gratuitously. It's got moving battle scenes. It has love scenes. I'll say this is not too much of a spoiler alert, because this is a character with a short-lived character. His name is Bahadur Khan. There's a character named Bahadur Khan. All I will say to the people who have not read this book yet is this character comes into the novel, and then not too long after, Tania whacks the character. And it was so awful that not only did I get goosebumps, and I'm getting them now kind of talking about it. I had to have a timeout. I had to just go take a little walk, because I felt so horrible about what had just happened. And I had to tell myself, dude, it didn't happen. It happened. It was in a novel. It was it's just an incredibly moving book, and it's a fun, compelling read. So that's my plug. Can you imagine if I would have blurbed the book? It would have been a sloppy paragraph on the back. Lute, tell us how you did it. No. Will you read to us a portion of it?
Yeah, thank you so much, Patrick. That means a lot to me. I thought, like you said, I think technically this might be I think this is the last reading I'm doing for the book tour. And so I thought I'd do something I've never done before, which is to read the final few pages. Because one of the objects that really captivated me when I was first starting the book was this automaton called Tipu's tiger. And it's a 6-foot long wooden automaton. It's a wooden tiger, a mechanical tiger that's mauling the throat of an English soldier. And this was a real object that exists in the V&A Museum, and I sort of fictionalized the creators. But one of the other objects early on that really struck me was this book, and it's called The Dream Register of Tipu Sultan. And it's a dream journal that this 18th century ruler kept, and he would write down his dreams every night, basically because he wanted to interpret them. He wanted someone to tell him how things were going to fare for him in war and diplomacy, and it's the only thing I had that was in his actual voice. And I just thought it was such a strange object. And so I thought I would read from this scene at the end of the novel. This takes place 50 years after the main events have taken place. This is after Tipu Sultan has been defeated, after he's been killed by the British. And here we're meeting his son, his only surviving son, who has traveled to London to the India House, which is a kind of precursor to a museum. A man steps foot inside the Oriental repository of the East India House. He shivers within his woolen shawl, the draft piercing his cotton camise. He finds most of the East India House distasteful and common, a warren of dark offices and weak-eyed clerks. The Oriental repository is a pleasant contrast. He takes in the high domed ceiling, its dazzling hues of azure and gold. In the center is a painting of a blackish, bare-breasted woman, offering up a platter of pearls to a toga-clad white woman. The man studies the painting so long, his neck stiffens. He drops his gaze to the walls, where the books of Tipu Sultan are ranged neatly on shelves. The man grazes his fingertips across a row of spines, inhaling their leather and dust, scents he used to hold sacred. From the clerk, he requests several books not on these shelves, quarantined for safekeeping. These are laid before him on a table, the Dream Register of Tipu Sultan, a treatise on letter writing, and some of Tipu's personal Qurans. He touches the first foxed page of the Dream Register, vaguely looking for his name, which he doesn't find. This is a slight but predictable disappointment. After all, Tipu had 12 sons. He, Ghulam Muhammad, is remarkable only for the fact that he is the last one alive. He pages through the middle of the Dream Register, whose honesty and vulnerability unnerve him. He never knew this version of his father. Talking cows? Big-breasted men? He imagines some common merchant rooting through his father's secrets, laughing. His face grows hot with anger and shame. He shuts the register. He must compose himself. In a few hours, he will be meeting with the Queen of England to petition for an increase in his clan's monthly stipend. He wishes to express dignity, not self-pity, on behalf of the hundreds of descendants living in forced seclusion in the malarial suburbs of Calcutta. For courage, he turns to a Quran he knows well, having seen it so many times in his father's hands. The leather is a warm reddish brown. Gilded vines blossom around the border, framing medallions and pendants of nastaliq. At the top is written, the God-given government. At the bottom, Allah is sufficient. Along the spine, none may touch it except the purified. The last sentence gives him pause. Can a prince, pensioned off by the English, ever be pure? His father would have said no. Better to live 2 days as a tiger than 200 days as a sheep, he used to say. As a child, Ghulam Muhammad asked his mother, tiger or sheep, which one am I? He never forgot her reply, clear and firm. You are a boy. A clerk is escorting him to the exit when he spots Tipu's tiger, crouched in the shadows of another room. The clerk waits as he circles it slowly, peering into the hollows, squinting at the holes on the shoulders where the tiger's incisors are sunk like knives. He smiles, a boy again. He remembers a European playing the keys. And there was someone else, wasn't there? The woodcarver, yes, working with unblinking concentration as if the entire turning of the earth depended on his turning of the crank. Ghulam Muhammad rests a hand on the flat between the tiger's ears. He lets a feeling blow through him, the sensation of touching a tree that once grew in Mysore, a tree that shaded people who are now dead. Both places, both times, vibrating within. Behind him, someone shifts. He turns, half expecting to see his father standing there, his hand on his patka, his attention absolute. But it's only the clerk, whose stern presence causes Ghulam Muhammad to remove his hand. He had thought it would pain him to part with his father's things, but as he passes through the dark room and out the double doors, the light comes as relief to his eyes. That's the end.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. So neat. Such a treat to hear that in your voice. Thank you very much. So there was a question in the comment box, and it's something I wanted to ask too. This is your first, maybe first of several historical novels.
The first, yeah. I mean, the Lion and Panther in London, which I published in Granted, was my first foray into historical fiction, but this is the first novel, yeah.
The first novel. And so the question that someone has asked here is, how much research did you do? And I'm wondering if you did all of your research, like, I know obviously, like, you're gonna, even if you do all of your research before you start, you're gonna do more research as you write. But what did you try to do all your research before you got started, or did you just let it come as you went?
I did a certain amount. I was not intending to do all the research before I got started, because for me, the research is part of the sort of, I mean, I think the nice thing about writing historical fiction is that it can be more of a collaborative effort than writing non-historical fiction, or things that you're not pulling from, things that actually happened. Like, the research for me informs choices I'm making in plot. It informs choices I'm making in character. It gives me ideas about things that could happen. And so I kind of do it I do it in the beginning as sort of to give myself a sense of authority, to feel like I have the authority to speak with a certain confidence about these people in this time. But most of that isn't really going into the novel. Most of it is just for me to feel better about myself and what I'm doing. And then but I'm also very impatient. I'm a sort of impatient researcher. I don't enjoy historical research that much. Certain things are interesting, but a lot of it is sort of dry to me and dense. And so I am fighting there's always a kind of struggle happening in the process for me in the beginning, where I just want to go, I just want to play, but I need to kind of force myself to work that muscle of patience and keep kind of slowing myself down in some ways.
It really speaks to how much the story grabbed you, the idea. If it drew you into an activity that you weren't so fond of going in, you weren't so patient with research. And did you know then did you know the arc of the novel before you started writing it, or were there any sort of surprising shifts in that?
Yeah.
And by arc, just like you know what I mean by arc, where it's going to end up, where the characters are going to be by the end of it.
Well, I actually thought of it as a heist novel. Initially, I thought I feel like when I'm trying to conceive of the novel structure, I try to think of the simplest possible structure, because I just want to believe that it will be a simpler project than it ends up being. And so I thought this will all take place in an English country house. It'll all be about these two people who are trying to get back this tiger, this automaton, from the wealthy English woman who owns it. And that is the last half to third, maybe third of the novel. But I then kept having to think about character, what kind of, who would be so moved that they would be willing to risk their reputation and their life and everything to get this tiger. And I just kept thinking about the person who made it. And that was my way of locating my own, like, why this object matters to me. I really only understood that after I sort of started thinking about this character as an artist. And that was my way to kind of find something personal in something that is this very distant, strange artifact. It helped me to kind of find my own, just what the urgency was for me in the object. So that was a big thing. So then I had to go back and kind of rebuild or start building from an earlier place than I thought it would be taking place. But the other thing that was a huge misstep on my part was I thought, okay, so then I had this first part in France, in India, and it's about this guy who is making this thing, and then it gets stolen by the British, and halfway through he dies in an early draft. I killed him, the creator of the automaton, and he came back as a ghost. And I just thought he'll just be a ghost for the second half of the novel. And I think I thought
Abbas
Abbas, the woodcarver. Because I just thought, how can I get a reader to believe that a guy, a woodcarver, low class guy, would have all these adventures? Like, the only way to make it believable is to make it completely speculative somehow. And so I did this whole thing, and I gave it to a reader, and she was like, love the first half. I do not understand what's going on with this ghost thing. It does not make any sense. And so I just had to sort of dismantle the entire second half. And maybe I also, I think I really was thinking a lot about Beloved, which is historical fiction and a ghost story. And I just loved it so much. And the idea of ghosts reckoning with history. But that was a huge misstep. And
so are you a writer who, and you can answer this just very briefly because I want to follow up on that, but are you a writer who writes it all out and then goes back and deals with all this stuff that you just poured out, or are you a writer who rewrites a lot as you go?
Yeah, I maybe I'm somewhere in the middle, but I'm not a let it all out kind of in the first draft and then redo. I think I did that once. I tried that once, and I found it really depressing to even look at it again. I just couldn't bring myself to look at it. What do you do? Do you do that?
No, exactly what you just said. Exactly. I mean, I do a lot of rewriting as I write, but I once tried it. I was like, I'm gonna do it.
Yeah.
Will Allison, his phrase is throw up and then clean up.
Yeah, I'm lazy. Maybe the cleanup part is just too depressing. I need some hope. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, some hope. It's funny. So the reason I ask is because I'm guessing then that second half had been polished. That second half had been made presentable for the world, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anne Patchett told me that, and I sort of witnessed some of this firsthand when I was a guest in her house, and it was quite dramatic. But when she was writing the Dutch House, and she got to the end, and then she realized, or right almost to the end, and she realized that she had made a horrible misstep halfway through, and it wasn't working. And the only way she was going to save the book was by removing that entire thing. None of it was usable because of what happened in it. And she told me afterwards that it was as if she had locked herself out of her house, and she was just walking around looking in the windows and trying all the doorknobs because she'd locked herself out of her book.
Yeah.
I thought that was it was I really felt for her.
Yeah.
But then I joked with her afterwards because she said I had to throw all those pages out, and I said I do it all the time. It's easy. It's easy to write whole things and chuck them. Do you know how many drafts you did, or is that question kind of unanswerable because of the way you work?
I think I did a lot. I don't know how many. I mean, I'm thinking in terms of big overhaul drafts, maybe like 20. But I think yeah, I was gonna say that I agree with you that hearing, so I don't know if this is what you just said, but hearing that the whole second half wasn't working was very hard, but throwing it out was actually liberating and easy, because I think that that was the question on my mind, is this, does this work? And just getting the answer, and just and somehow it would be worse if I had no idea that the second half wasn't working. I had some sense that this is going to be the kind of sharp left turn that either you make it or you don't. And I also feel like it can be sort of paralyzing to just stop at the middle and be like, well, should I make this decision or should I not make this decision? And to try to like think it through and think ahead. And the only way to step through the right door is by stepping through the wrong door first sometimes. Like, I don't think that I would have saved myself time by not having made this wrong left turn. I think I had to make it in order to feel confident about what was actually ended up being the right way.
That's such a good thing that you just said. Yes. I really feel most of the time that I have to, even on a sentence level, I have to write it incorrectly once or twice or a few times before I get it the way I want it. And it's the same way with sometimes with whole scenes, just starting a scene and starting it again and thinking, oh my God, this is awful. And then finally figuring it out. But it's only because I was willing to just scrap. I have, like probably a lot of writers, I have this file called whatever it's called, scraps, and whenever I'm just going to get rid of some chunk and it's maybe a paragraph or it's 50 pages, it goes in there because I think one day, and I've never once gone back and gotten anything out of it.
Yeah,
ever.
That's so true. Yeah.
It's just
I-
it's astounding to me.
Yeah, I'm sort of at square one again, where I'm trying to work on something new. And yeah, I think I'm thinking a lot about this essay by Deborah Eisenberg, and there's a paragraph where she talks about resistance and resisting the first impulse or even the second impulse. But it's like you're saying, you have to just do the first thing or the second thing before you can resist it. You can't resist something that doesn't yet exist, or the sentence that doesn't yet exist. But
yeah, that's well put. There's a quote I want to read from you that I thought was fantastic, where you said, I still consider myself, this is from your interview, I think with Virginia Living, I still consider myself a student of writing as much as I am a writer. I always feel I have so much to learn, which is an exciting place to be. And I wonder if you could just, I don't know, do you want to say anything more about that? Because it's something that I feel very strongly about personally, because I don't ever want to be done learning how to do it, because it's interesting to be doing something you're learning how to do. It's much more interesting than doing something that you feel like you just know how to do and you're doing it.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I only really understood this when I began teaching and when I began sitting in on other people's classes, creative writing classes, which is why I think conferences like these are so amazing, not just for the students, but for faculty to see. Whenever I go to a conference, I never miss the chance to sit in on other writers' classes, craft classes. And I took online craft classes because this was during the pandemic when I was writing. I sat in on classes with Megha Majumdar or Karen Russell. And I can remember, Karen Russell's was about food. It was just really about food and what food can do in a scene. And that prompted just just unlocked a whole way of thinking about character that I hadn't thought about before. So great. I think there are general ways of thinking about writing, but the most useful kind of lessons for me are ones that are very idiosyncratic to the writer who's talking about their process and what worked for them. It's not going to work for me every time. It's not something I'm taking forward now, for the rest of my life, but you just sometimes when you're in the midst of work need the right piece of advice or the right prompt at the right time. And that really helped me throughout the writing of this book.
That's great. That's wonderful. Off the top of your head, have you learned well, let me start this again. Can you think off the top of your head of something that you learned about writing from the editorial process?
Of this book.
Or just working with an editor and you came out of that. I know it's kind of out of the blue, I'm asking you this, but you know, coming out of it and thinking, oh, I didn't know that before, and now I know it, and I'm going to carry it forward.
Well, one thing I learned in the editorial process of my first book, and I still think about, is my editor, who was wonderful. Her name is Jordan Pavlin. She's edited all my books, and it was just one note somewhere where she said, is this the strongest word to end the sentence, or the strongest word to end the paragraph, or the space break or something? And I hadn't thought about the balance, the way kind of waiting the end of a sentence or the end of a scene, or but with the right word, just thinking about the impact of that. It feels sort of obvious when I say it out loud, but it was a kind of like small note that I have carried forward, and when I'm editing other people's work, I point out. The other thing with this book, I feel like every time she has helped me structurally a lot, and I care a lot about the kind of pacing of the book and the changes in pacing towards the end, and I wanted a kind of propulsion to the ending. I also am always like interested in other characters, and I have a tendency to kind of like jump ship, like jump into somebody else's perspective just because I find it interesting. And she was helping me think about where I could sort of pare down and really focus on the things and the people that mattered, and the action that was mattering towards the end of the book. But there was push and pull there, but it helped me to clarify to myself why it was important for me to include voices that aren't necessarily the primary voices we've been hearing from. So I think it's good to have an editor that you can also kind of push against a little bit too. So you really can be behind the choices you're making, I think. Do you find that?
Yeah, I do. And I have found across the board with editors, magazines and book editors, that usually if they're prescriptive, it's something very small that I agree with, and anything that's bigger than something small, they are suggestive. They just open up a million little conversations.
Yes,
and it's great. It's really great. I remember one thing I learned from Susan Campbell was when she edited my first book, and she wrote in all over the place. She wrote OC. It was one of the abbreviations, OC, and I was trying to figure it out. And I finally said, what's that mean? And she said, oh, over choreographed. And she said, I'll show you one example. And it was something where I had written, a character drinking from a glass of water. And I said, he took hold of the glass and brought it up to his lips and tilted the glass, and then the water by gravity went down. That's like,
yeah.
And then something that I picked up from the editor I'm working with now is that she taught me this word lacuna. Do you know this word? Lacuna?
No, I know, I've heard this word, but I don't know what it is.
It's a loose definition is it's the missing parts, it's the gaps, it's the things that aren't there. And it came up in a context of like a huge editorial comment that said, what if you weave in this and this that was going on at this time, and just mention this, but don't put it in too much, and keep in mind all the necessary lacuna. And I read that and I thought, what the fuck's lacuna? First, that was my first reaction. And then I looked it up. But that advice has trickled down really nicely into my writing, I think, in terms of editing myself, because now I think of it even in the space in between scenes, in the space just in between that action and the next action. Maybe it's just better just to go right from there to there, and I was thinking with Lute, you must have chosen so many things to leave out. And I get in part it's because of the voice. And I wanted to ask you two craft questions before I give you my nerd lightning round. But two craft questions. One is you've written a book in present tense.
Mm-hmm.
And as we know, writing involves so many decisions, and that was a decision you made. You had other options, and you wrote it in third person. You wrote it in a kind of omniscient narrator that could drift here and drift there. Those were choices that you made. Did you try it another way, even if it was just for a few pages, or did you know it from the get-go? That's how you wanted to tell it. You know, did the story you wanted to tell kind of shape the way you then told it, or vice versa?
I think the research shaped the voice, because I was encountering things that were that I found absurd, or absurd sometimes in a funny way, sometimes in a infuriating way. And I wanted to, I knew I was writing a novel that deals with serious subjects, but I also felt like I wanted to have fun, and I wanted a kind of irreverence about the way in which the history is being handled to come across through the voice. I felt like there's this irreverence to the object itself, the Tipu's tiger. It's dark and it's grotesque and sinister. It's also kind of funny to me. And the soldier kind of is like trying weakly to defend himself from being
And the expression on his face as he's getting eaten, where he looks like somebody just knocked over his tea.
Yeah. Yeah, I just thought, I think that humor is one of the ways in which something can feel instantly contemporary also. Like it can, when it's, humor is very subjective, but somehow I think humor can kind of ground characters in a way that just brings them in, that brings immediacy to the work, in the same way that present tense brings immediacy and brings a sense of things not having happened yet, that events are still in flux, that we don't, even though we do know what happens in history, we still don't know what's going to happen for them, and that's the experience that they are having as they live through history.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. And I want to ask you about one other aspect of the book, and then let me say first, we're sort of segging into the Q&A period. I've got my eye on the Q&A box, and we've addressed the one that's in there now. So while I am talking away and asking these questions, anybody out there who wants to ask anything, I'm keeping an eye on it. So please ask away. There's a section in the novel, I say this as a fellow writer, we write these books and we think, I want to try this, I want to try that. And then there are all kinds of rules out there. And the rules say things like, you can't have a narrator that does this. You can't have multiple first person narrator. You can't have a main character who's under the age of 8. You can't. And, the ultimate, I think that the bottom line is, well, okay, but you can go to hell. I mean, because we all agree, oh yeah, well, that's really good, but that it's because that, it's so good. Anything that there's a rule that says, oh, don't do that, don't switch from, like as a writer, I don't have an interest in switching from third to first, say, in a long project. But as a reader, I think it's cool, it's interesting, anything people, writing teachers say, don't do, question. That's, I think, just question. It's like, what are you talking about? Why? I don't know why there's a do and a don't. There's just a how, try it, see what you can do. So in the middle of your novel, you do something that all of us would love to do. And you did it, like you gave us one of these examples where now we can all go, Tania James did it. Didn't you read the middle section of that? Middle of this novel, it's written in third person present tense, is suddenly there's 20 pages of a seaman's journal written in 1802, which fits right into the, the chronological flow of the novel, and it fits into the story. It definitely is just carrying on with Abbas's narrative. But I mean, okay. Did you do that? Here's a really harsh question. Did you do that because you were like backed into a corner at one point and you thought, I'm so bored with this, I don't know what I'm going to do. I need a breath of fresh air. I'm going to do a journal entry. Or did you do it because you thought that is the best way to get across this sea voyage part? And did anybody, this is a three-part question, did anybody say to you, don't do it, take it out, you can't do that?
Yeah, I definitely did it first. I think there was a sense of I'm getting bored here. For me, like I can read a novel, a long novel that is in one point of view, one place. It really, I don't need to read something that breaks with the form. But I think whenever I get to the midpoint of my own kind of, when I'm writing a novel, I start to feel a little bit like, I don't know. I want to inject that sense of play again into what I'm doing. I think I did try to write it. I did try to write it in a third person perspective where Abbas leaves, he sneaks on, he gets onto a boat, he gets onto an East India Company ship and he becomes, assistant to the carpenter. And that's really how he gets to France from India. And I did try to write in third person and it felt both leaden and also kind of over choreographed, like to use your editor's excellent term. It just felt like I was now trying to make you believe that we're now on a ship. And so now I have to describe what I've already forgotten all the terminology that people use on ships. But I wanted some efficient way to kind of move through this world that's still emotional. And as I was researching, mariners' memoirs, I just thought their voices are so much more vulnerable and honest, and they're captivating in some way. And I liked the idea of looking at Abbas from the perspective of someone we haven't seen before. And I think that's why I like moving perspectives, because what I'm always interested in is not just one consciousnness, but the way another consciousness perceives that person in a completely different way. And I also just thought, it's sort of like movement that feels right in a sort of emotional or tonal way, that he has been ripped from his home and he's leaving his home. It's a huge, just such a massive traumatic kind of phase of his life. To try to give it the same language and tone and grammar of the first third just didn't feel true to what the experience of that would have been like. So I don't know. I mean, I think that it was a choice that kind of arose out of some sense of boredom or chafing against whatever sort of tone I had been working with all along. I think that's true.
I'm so glad I asked that question. That was such an interesting answer. And I really love that you came at it in part because it was the absolute best way to realistically handle. I totally get what you're saying, that if it's from his point of view, Abbas's point of view, then he's new to that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all got to register, or at least the newness has to be acknowledged and nodded to over and over again. But if you have it in this, you don't have to do that. So interesting. One of our audience members has asked, what are you reading right now? And who are some of the working writers that you're reading who are doing stuff that is exciting to you? Whether you think, are good writers for budding writers to read.
I just read The Plot by Jean Corlitz, which is a great summer read and so propulsive, and it was just fantastic. In terms of writers I see as doing exciting work, I mean, there's so many. I think that Laura Vandenberg is someone who is kind of constantly sort of pushing herself in terms of form and just the shapes of her stories. And the last book of hers was a story collection, I Hold a Wolf by the Ears. I've taught that before. I think there's certain books like Daniel Evans's last collection, The Office of Historical Corrections, I think that's what it's called. But there's certain collections that I can feel my students sort of light up with a kind of excitement and energy and a desire to write. I feel that too when I read their work. And they're both also really good at giving language to their craft choices. So who else? Exciting work. Oh, I love Maud Casey's volume. She did a book for the Grey Wolf Press series called On Mystery. I think I probably underlined that entire book. I mean, speaking of your note about lacuna, Patrick, I think that's what she's largely talking about and arguing for, is kind of preserving and kind of respecting the kind of private life, the secret life of characters, the secret life of the story. Which, you know, I think sometimes, especially as I'm writing early drafts, I'm thinking a lot about making things clear to a reader and making the interiority clear to the reader. Sometimes I need to write a lot of interiority to make it clear to myself, but that there's something else lost, some ineffable quality of being human, that complexity, that mysteriousness, like we can't even access about ourselves. So I love that book as a craft book, On Mystery by Maud Casey.
I'm going to check it out. I have not read it. There was something I read, a quote of yours somewhere that said something about how you loved getting into, you loved having a narrative voice in Loot that could sort of be a presence, and I'm not even paraphrasing, I'm just putting words in your mouth, but visibly steer, you know, like could step in and influence and be a presence. And I thought of that with what you were just saying, because I've noticed with this thing I'm working on now, which I've been working on since I think 1907, and it's got a lot of characters and I've spent a lot of time with them. And so on the one hand, this nods toward two things you've said. On the one hand, when you work on something for a long time, you have to somehow keep your sense of what it will be like for somebody to not be so familiar with this situation and with these people. What you have to keep putting yourself into the head, audience awareness. It's just constant audience, I think, audience awareness. Like, not only they don't know this, and this, but they haven't spent any time with these characters. It's totally new to them all over again. You have to like feel like it's totally new to you. But I noticed with trying to have a kind of narrator that I think you described, that there are times where I pull that narrator back from describing things, not for the sake of honoring lacunas, well, maybe it is that, but for the sake of respecting the privacy of the characters. You know, there are a couple of scenes I've encountered where, and I see this in reading, and when I read it, they get away with it. It's great. And when I'm doing it, I feel like, no, red flag, you know, but where I just basically pull the camera and let these people be alone for that moment. Not for something naughty or something like that, you know, but just like a difficult moment, and everybody knows it's a difficult moment and doesn't necessarily have to be shown, and it's more powerful when it's not.
Yes.
You know, when you start to learn the power of not putting something in.
Yeah, the sort of, it's just making me think too of, it seems like a corresponding analog for this might be in film, where in some, I think the impulse is to go for the close-up when you're showing something very emotional that an actor is doing. But sometimes, like in films, there's a Taiwanese director, I think he's Taiwanese, named Ho Xiaoshan. I think if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but sometimes his most emotional scenes would be very wide shot, and you would almost be in the doorway of a room watching someone have a really emotional experience. And that feels somehow less, you know, it just feels real. It just feels like you're part of the room, experiencing it in a completely different way, perhaps a less manipulated way. Than
I know, it's more like straight on voyeurism.
Yes.
Not, yeah. One person asked how long from start to finish with Loot, calendar wise, like when did you first start writing it to to the publication of the book?
I started thinking about it before my second son was born. So that would be 2017 probably. And then writing, I think I sold it in 2021. I think so. So I probably finished it around 2020. So 3-4 years. Yeah.
Okay, very quickly. Here are the nerdy lightning round questions. The first one was, how long did it take you to write? So good on everybody. We're done with that one. You said the story aerograms in your little Q&A that you did with Hannah back in 2007, and you said that story took you 4 months to write over a 2-year period, but like 4 months of writing time broken up over.
I must have been lying. Okay. No.
Well, I was going to ask, is that kind of average for a short story? Have you had stories that just plop out of you? Well, sound like a baby, but stories that just kind of.
Only once have I had a story that just came very quickly. That was a story called The Liberator, and it was actually not that long, and that's never happened to me again. I feel like it's somehow, it's very mysterious to me and mystical to me, and I would love for that to ever happen to me again, but it hasn't. It was kind of a strange turn of luck. I don't know. Has that ever happened to you?
Never.
Yeah. I don't think it'll ever happen for me either again.
Never. I mean, I try every once in a while. I just think I'm going to work it all out, get it all planned out, and then I'm going to do this thing that all of my friends are doing. But I'm not in that club. I don't know. Did you work on any other pieces of writing while you worked on Loop?
I did. Yeah. I really needed to work on things here and there. Like when I would finish a draft, I going back to the idea of trying to stay playful and remind myself of what I enjoy. Sometimes writing a novel can feel like moving the furniture around, like you said, the character has to cross the room or whatever. All these getting characters just from one space to another feels sort of like drudgery, and short stories are just so fun. And I don't know, by comparison to me, they are more fun. And so I would write flash fictions, mostly just very short things that I knew I could finish in like a week. And maybe, what'd you say?
No, go ahead.
No, like not that they were like done perfect, but just that I could get something out.
Were you working a job while you wrote the novel?
Yeah, I was teaching. I still teach at George Mason University's MFA program.
So you were teaching and you were raising 2 children.
Yeah.
And you wrote a novel. Just saying, none of us have any excuses for not getting shit done. This is my last question, and it's the only hard question I have, although maybe it's an easy question. Let's say you're a writer and you're writing fiction and you haven't published a book yet, and maybe you haven't published a story yet, but maybe you published some stories today, and you are writing fiction with the aspiration of being a published writer and having readers, that thing we like. Why write short stories?
If you are a short story writer, like why continue to write short stories?
No. Like, why would or should a writer writing today who has not had a book yet, so they're working toward that goal, why should they work on short stories as well as, say, trying to write a novel, or why pursue the form? Do you think it's wise, or do you think if somebody really is leaning toward being a novelist, they should just follow their novelist vibe?
I think short story writers are kind of, I think they are dogged. I think people who love to write short stories, I think have an understanding, and I've heard a lot of things about how novels are easier to sell. But if you love writing short stories, I just don't think that the marketing problems are going to stop you from writing them. I just think, some people just think in those terms, like you can see the shape of something, or you're given to certain kind of experimentation and play. I mean, I think I read somewhere that Alice Munro, so many of her stories, she thought they were going to be novels and they would just end gracefully at page 50 or whatever. And I just think that short story writers can't really help themselves. It's just something in your DNA. But I like to think of myself as having a hand in both things. For me, I think short story writing sustains the part of me that wanted to be a writer in the first place. Because I think the part of me that wanted to be a writer, the part of me that when I was 8 years old and I wrote a story from the perspective of a pencil sharpener or something, I just, that sense of I can do anything I want, I can take any risk, that part of yourself is so hard to preserve over time as the sort of demands of the market or demands of publishing or these other things begin to encroach on your creative life. But there's something about writing short stories that preserves that private part of the self, that kind of connection to what your own sort of idiosyncrasies are, the things that interest you, the things that you find fun and daring to play with. And I just think one of the biggest goals for me as a writer, as I continue, if I have the fortune to continue, is to just keep taking risks. And short stories are just they just thrive on risk, I think. So I think that's reason.
Yeah.
It's reason to keep going.
That's a great answer. Thank you. We have one question. I know we're almost out of time. There's a question about the illustrations in the book, which are fantastic, and they're few, but they're great. And I know that I, as a reader of this book, did not look up the tiger on YouTube. I just went by your illustrations. So that's all I had in my head. Were you tempted to use more? Were you tempted to in any capacity, just make the book more illustrated?
I would have. I mean, I had read Edward Carey's Little, and I was like, okay, I definitely can't add more, because I mean, this genius is out here, that making these incredible drawings. And I mean, he's just thinking so much about space and, the interplay between text and illustration. I'm just not hitting on that plane as a artist. But the few ones I had, I just thought these are really delightful. I was really happy when my publisher told me I didn't have to take them out. I have to say the person who asked that question is Aisha Pachabuchek. I'm seeing your name in the Q&A. And
It is, in fact.
she is one of those, her collection, the Trojan War Museum, going back to the earlier question about books that I was reading during this time, one of the stories in that collection, which is so fabulous, is about a automaton, a chess playing automaton. And then there's another story that also does a lot of things with the omniscient voice. That was really inspiring to me in terms of how to approach omniscient voice, how to just take crazy risks, like having the narration address the reader out of nowhere. I don't know that I really do that, but those stories, that collection I highly recommend too, in terms of just seeing what kind of risks that you can take within the space of a short story. I think that's a craft lesson that is, hugely helpful.
Yeah, that's really great. And she wrote a great story called Good Fortune.
Mm-hmm.
It was published by a little magazine that we all know. That's a wonderful book.
Yeah.
Trojan Museum. And one last very quick question, and I'm trying to condense a long question that I'm reading in the question Q&A box. And I think that this is the best way I can do it, is when you're working on a novel and you've got scene, and you've got event, and you've got to, like you were just saying, you have to get from here to there. You have all these mechanics you have to deal with. And if you get overwhelmed by these things and you take these scenes and you just take them out, like, number one, do you ever do anything with them, or are they just orphans for the rest of their lives? But do they tell you anything about, like, do they tell you, do they provide for you as much as you lose by having written them and having taken them out? Do they tell you more about the novel and about where you want to go?
Like the scenes that I've taken out, basically.
Yeah, all those things that you end up, those directions you take, and like for me, it's a 6-month journey sometimes, and then I'll realize, oh no, I got to go back to that point.
Yeah, I think I didn't realize this until you mentioned it, but I don't actually use anything I've cut. I mean, I do save everything, but I can't remember last time I pulled something back in. And there is something I cut of a character named Middle John, who is sort of a farm, he works on the farm, and I had this whole beautiful, I mean, to me, it was like, not to say that it was a beautiful scene, but I felt like very connected to him. Like I just felt I cared so much about him because of this memory I had of him. That was actually from that Karen Russell prompt about food. And I had him eating this pear, and this pear prompts this memory. And I just, it is no longer in the book, but it somehow, I'm trying to think how it, I don't know that the reader, I don't know that it matters to the novel. It's just for me, I guess. I just feel connected to him, and I feel he's sort of important to me because of this stuff that I cut. But I don't know if it would have been different if it had never existed in the first place. Like if this character would have read differently. I don't think so.
Yeah, that's, I totally get that. That sort of plugs into what you were saying too, about just having to write something a certain way to, and also to research, like having to read so much of Tipu's dream diary, if that's the right way to put that, to get a sense of his voice, even though you didn't necessarily use a lot of it.
Yeah, I guess it's trying to find, these are ways of finding your own personal stakes in the story itself, which doesn't matter necessarily to the story, but it matters to your own stamina in terms of how much time and how much energy you're willing to give to this work. Yeah.
That's really true. It lets you know how much time you want to spend with it, and that changes over time.
Yes.
Just like a relationship, like any other relationship.
Oh, yes.
Thank you so much. This was so much fun. I think I got through all the questions that came in, and we got to my lightning round, so I'm happy. And it was really, really fun. Thanks again to Community and Stephanie for hosting us.
Yes, thank you, Patrick. This was amazing. And it was just so lovely to end my book discussions with you.
Oh, yeah, we can do the end of
I've known for so long. And thank you to Stephanie and Community Bookstore and all of you at One Story. It's such an honor to be back with you.
Honor for us. Thanks.
Thank you both so much. You can order loot from us. I also hope you get to see the art that this is inspired by eventually, or not, or just experience it through the images and through the book. Thank you so much to One Story, and I hope everyone has a great night. Say good night. Bye.